Thank you, Amanda, for that kind introduction. And thank you to John for agreeing to be in conversation about this book and for all the attendees. I know it's a busy time for everyone, so I appreciate you coming to hear me blather on about my book. And I hope, as I said to Jonathan in the beginning, I hope this is going to be more of a conversation because Jonathan's work has a lot of, our work has a lot of entanglements with one another in the best possible way. So, by way of very, very brief introductory comments, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the major arguments for the book, and then a little bit about maybe its contemporary relevance. And I think we're talking about state and coercion and governance. It's hard to ignore what's going on in the U.S. today. Now, the I think the origins of this book and its development are best summed up by a conversation that happened at the Wissenschaft College zu Berlin several years ago when I said, I made the proposition, what does the history of the empire look like from the perspective of labor, through the lens of labor? What kind of view do we get of the British Empire if we look at it primarily through the lens of labor? And one of the presenters there commented kind of archly, a distorted one, which I thought was not inaccurate. I think every lens we use brings some things into clarity and distorts others. And I think my goal with this book was really to offer that perspective. What does the empire look like if we look at the empire itself as primarily a labor control entity and a racialized labor control entity? I'm not saying that's the be all end all of what the British Empire or what European empires are, but I do think they are a very, very crucial aspect of it. And I was trying to, in the course of the book, make the case for it potentially being a central aspect, or how does our view of its history and the history of colonialism, the history of the colonial encounter change when we put labor control at the center of it. Um, so in the book, I make three primary arguments that, along with territorial control and control of trade, labor control was at the center of 19th century British imperialism. The second argument is that after 1834, the British Empire in its tropical colonies is best understood neither as a post-slavery state nor as an abolitionist state, but as what I call, as the title suggests, an overseer state. That its disparate regions were tied together by a structure of institutions, laws, practices, and concepts that constitute a coherent and powerful mechanism to control the empire's most valuable resource, not gold or silver or sugar, but labor. Thirdly, that the transition from slavery to indenture and the overseer state's pervasive intervention restructured the social, cultural, economic, and political makeup of Britain's tropical plantation and mining territories, from the interior of Malaysia to southern Africa to the Anglo-Caribbean. That these experiments in rule spread between colonies and also set precedents for what would happen in Britain itself in terms of the government's increasing control in labor regulation. Colonial labor control thus constituted a laboratory of governance, where new principles and processes were introduced well in advance of their implementation in the metropole. And in the work I'm doing now, the new book, I make the same argument with regards to public health and health governance, which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A or if it comes up in the conversation with Jonathan. And lastly, I argue that the merger of the state and Britain's global plantation mining complex means we must reinterpret the historical significance of a crucial set of encounters, plantation workers' ubiquitous contestation with ground level state agents and institutions. So the overseer state in this work appears not merely as a top-down edifice, but one that shaped and was shaped by everyday contact between the rulers and the ruled. So I think, as is always the case when you talk about something that you really, for all intents and purposes, have stopped working on several years before it was published. What I was thinking about before the talk was how unfortunate it is that a book about labor, immigration, coercion in the state seems to have more contemporary relevance now than it did even when I started writing it, which was considerable. As we watch the United States engage in what could be euphemistically titled another experiment in radical coercive governance. I was struck by a passage in the book which goes like this, and it's talking about the contrast between a state that presents itself as being liberal and increasingly structured around ideas of freedom, but in practice is increasingly coercive, which I know is a main theme in Jonathan's work as well. And this is page 11 of the book for those of you keeping score at home. This discordance between practice and principle, despite repeated attempts to reconcile them through a malleable racial discourse, was a constant source of tension and a perennial generator of instability. The legal system facilitated the daily deployment of intimidation, coercion, and violence as mechanisms of labor control. The camouflaging of these systems under the rubric of labor and immigration law strengthened the hand of plantation managers and local judicial authorities by criminalizing workers' attempts to avoid or resist such regulations. It also justified the violent suppression of collective resistance or mass demonstration, branding their participants criminals and even rebels. And here's where there's a more hopeful kind of tone to this. But the self-same legal system that shackled workers to their employers also precluded the latter and their judicial allies from deploying the full panoply of authoritarian control measures. As critics of the system, and sometimes laborers themselves, were quick to point out, workers remained legally entitled to rights and protections due to all Crown subjects. And I think this actually differentiates Crown subjects from the primary targets of ICE officials today. The stark racial inequalities promoted by the system prompted a steady stream of moral censure and legal challenges from humanitarians, anti-slavery campaigners, judicial contrarians, and Indian activists that grew in volume across the decades preceding the First World War. Although workers could be, and often were, beaten, jailed, or even killed, the record of these events provided a powerful leverage for the critics of the systems, even as they provoked ever more determined adaptation, contestation, and defiance by those entangled within it. So I think it raises interesting questions about the status of migrant cohorts, racialized migrant cohorts, in a system that has common law Crown subject status versus a system that draws a much sharper line between legal residents and allegedly undocumented or illegal residents. And that's something, like I said, we might want to explore in the Q&A. But I'm kind of what's the right word? Distressed that this seems to be so contemporary. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jonathan.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for being here. Thanks, Amanda, for the introduction. And Sascha, thanks for inviting me to join you in conversation about your fascinating book. I thought I'd just show the book in my analog way. Here it is. Um, and I have tons of questions, as you can imagine, but I'm going to ask some conversational questions for a bit, and then we'll try to open to everyone. So if you have a question come to mind while we're speaking, feel free to put it in the chat or raise your hand. And as Sasha said, we'll try to make this as much of a conversation as possible. Um, I thought I'd start with your title, maybe following up on the summary of the argument you just gave us. And I always love it when titles don't just describe the subject, but tell you something about the argument. And I think that's the case here. So could you tell us more about your concept of the overseer state, how you came to it perhaps, and what it means in terms of the arguments of the book?
Sure, sure. Well, the initial title was not the Overseer State. The initial title, and for a long time, the working title was Men Sold Like Pigs, which actually comes from I think it's a Cantonese phrase, which was the reference to indenture. You've probably come across this yourself, as they called it muzhuzhai, which is the trade in piglets. But when
Mhm.
I gave the talk at Columbia, Mei Nai, who had just finished her own book about Chinese migration, said, I wouldn't use that title. It's considered, that term is considered very offensive. And this
Mhm.
required some soul searching to say, okay, like what if this is how the critics of the system referred to it, is it legit to use that now as a book title? And in the end, I decided, because this is my second book and not my fourth, that I was like, well, I'm going to err on the side of caution here and change
Mhm.
it.
Mhm.
And the term overseer state was actually already in the book. So I just pulled it out and I used it because I thought it captured that halfway point between a coercive, completely coercive situation with enslaved labor and the free labor situation. And then it evokes the idea that the overseer as a figure, as a kind of mediator between owners, proprietors, and the laborers themselves. And that's really central to the argument of the book, that the state doesn't just completely take over control of the labor system, but increasingly acts as a mediator who is certainly
Mhm.
on the side of proprietors and owners, but bills itself as that intermediary between between workers and managers. First is the intermediary between the enslaved and slave owners, and then later is the intermediary between indentured laborers and the plantation and mine owners.
Hmm. That's really interesting and nice to hear the behind the scenes part of your thinking, but the term certainly, for me as a reader, helps track some of the arguments about continuity across the divide of abolition. Um, and I guess that relates to my next question, which is that one fascinating thing about the book is its long time span. It covers roughly a century from the early 19th century to early 20th century, and in so doing, it crosses a set of conventional markers that tend to separate out discrete subjects, slavery and amelioration, emancipation and indenture, anti-colonial nationalism by the time we get to the end. And on my reading, the point of writing this over this long time span wasn't just to include more. It's not just to continue the story. It's really more integral to the kind of arguments that you're making, some of which are about continuity and change over the long term. So could you talk about that, about why writing over a long period of time is important
Oh
in your.
yeah, no, that's a really good question, and I think you know I think it's a very natural instinct as one kind of gets across one's scholarly trajectory to try to write these big books. Not necessarily, not everyone's ready to write grand narratives, but you do find yourself moving between time periods and thinking more about both continuity and dissonance. And I think it's also very natural to become if not uncomfortable, then to see as problematic the accepted divisions of whatever subject you're working on. And the big one, as you know, is that kind of pre-emancipation and post-emancipation period. You know, most books that write about this go up to 1834 and then stop, or start at 1834 and then go forwards, which again is a completely legitimate way of doing things. But I wanted to problematize that a little bit and say, okay, you know, if we are the advantage of focusing on the state, for example, is to say, okay, if we're looking at the state, you know, as opposed to the institution of slavery, some could very well argue that in various forms it continued. I mean, that was Tinker's classic argument, right? That this is a new indenture is a new form of slavery. But if we're
Sure.
looking at state methods of labor control, state interest in labor, you know, where does that really start to accelerate? And when, if ever, does it end? Um, I had always imagined myself never becoming a historian of slavery because the the historiography was so intimidating. You know, there was so much of it, and it was so complex, and it was so far advanced, and there were so many great thinkers in it on all different aspects of it. The idea of actually trying to make an original argument in the midst of that incredibly rich field was just really daunting. And I still don't know if I mean any part succeeded. But the more I tried to trace the origins of these systems and the idea of labor control, the more I found myself going back primarily into amelioration,
Mhm.
because that's really when this, to my mind, that's when this really starts. AT, the really that first, kind of 1811 moving forwards, and I now with the next book I take it back even farther, and I talk about, okay, when does the health of workers become defined as a state enterprise, as a state concern, and that takes it back into the 18th century. Again, always daunting to push yourself back on chronology at the same time you're expanding your geography, and that's where I think it structurally it really helps to choose your actual topic of what you're writing about very, very carefully and say, I'm not going to write some giant history of labor across all of the, mid 18th all the way up to the early 20th. But if I'm writing specifically about the changing role of the state, the concept of labor control and its practice, then I think one can be justified. But if I had the time and I wasn't so exhausted by the end of it, I would have wanted to talk, for example, a lot more about the regulation of free of white labor in these regions as well, and how that also borrowed from these techniques that are developed in the late 18th and early 19th century. I would have wanted to talk about the implications of these experiments in labor control for British labor control, because I think there's real parallels between how enslaved labor and indentured labor is managed, and how free labor in Britain itself becomes managed in later years. And those are really this thing I'm working on now about kind of the origins of public health really pulls those out.
Hmm. That's really interesting to hear, and certainly part of the ambition of the book and what makes it so thought-provoking is that is the arguments in relation to time, and that effort to cross boundaries in a specific way, not just in a synthetic, let's include more information,
Yeah.
but with regard to state power.
Yeah, and
Um,
that it's
yeah.
worth sort of saying too that the people that you and I cite, I mean, folks like Alessandro Stanziani, Olbe Bosma, they are often talking in these very broad sweeps, very broad conceptual ideas. And that's why I think your engagement with the idea of the ideology of an idea of freedom is so effective,
Mhm.
because it's one of
Mhm.
those topics that you can really engage across decades and watch it evolve and watch contested versions of it.
Right, there needs to be something specific to follow.
Yeah,
Otherwise, it kind of descends into just lots of interesting things happening, but without the same cohesive kind of argument.
yeah,
So another element I wanted to ask about, and I thought this might come as more of a surprise to some readers, is that this is a book primarily about the British Empire. But I was struck while reading by your interest in connections between the British world and other empires and states, the Dutch and the Spanish empires, China in certain respects. You write, I'm quoting from the introduction here. You write that the overstate, quote, the overseer state borrowed from both continental modes of rule and labor organization, and in Southeast Asia from Chinese and Indian ones. So, can you tell us more about how the book explores these dynamics, about some layered and inter-imperial relationships that come
yeah.
to
No,
your analysis of labor?
No, I'm glad you picked up on that because one never knows, you write something with intent, you're not sure how readers receive it, and I think that's really crucial. Um, yeah, I mean the parallels between imperial viceregal slave management, slave labor management, and British slave management in the Anglo-Caribbean are multitudinous. Um, in some ways just the idea that the regulation of labor is something the state should do, especially in slave labor. I mean, that's really borrowed from the Spanish and French systems, to the point that, as you well know, the in former French colonies, the legal code was still referred to as the Code Noir. And there's a great moment in which you might have come across in your own studies, in the early kind of reform of the Mauritian slave laws. Actually, sorry, the later reform. This happens, I think, in like 1827 or so, where you have a group of French-descended Mauritian plantation owners who appeal to the British magistrates and say, well, we did it this way because this is the way it's always been done under Romano-Dutch law. And the magistrate says, those plantation owners need to understand that they are under the British system now. So the legacy of those laws is a contested one, but very, very visible across the British Empire, especially in the Caribbean, where you have, again, as you know, these agents and officials taken directly from viceregal rule. I mean, guys like the fiscal, which is a
Right.
Dutch position, the use of the cedula real, which is just Spanish intervention, and even broader, that very idea that the work and lives of the enslaved population is a concern for the king because they are technically in part royal property. And there's also issues of public order, so one of the specific ones besides these specific positions I find so interesting is the implementation of a slave census, which again starts with the cedula, I think it's the cedula real of 1789 that introduces it. And that's one of the first things that the British adopt. They just say, in order to manage the slave trade, we need an accurate count of the number of enslaved people, and they go right back to the Spanish system and adopt it again. And it's that old thing of, the British have always been masters of adapting the governmental innovations of others. From
Hmm.
this to the joint stock company, which was a Dutch invention, banking system, the British, the 19th century get this reputation of being great innovators, but they're actually more like, in some ways, great vulgarizers. They take these complex systems and they adopt them, and then they put over this other ideology that this is really about liberalism, this is really about rational governance, this is really about the government of experts. But when you peel back those layers, you see practices that are centralized and coercive.
Yeah. I
Um,
think
I
it's so, yeah,
Yeah, go
sorry,
ahead.
sorry,
No, no,
just
no, go
say
ahead. No, go ahead.
I hope that I did find this aspect of the book very interesting. I hope it becomes more and more of a research agenda or is integrated into research of this kind, because of course it's not an isolated phenomenon. There's so many of these key colonies where indenture and other coercive labor systems took place that have a prior colonial history. And yet it's not easy and also not conventional to sort of think specifically about that prior history in understanding
Yeah, yeah.
the British
Well,
history of emancipation. Right.
I think that metaphor of the palimpsest is really useful.
Right.
They call it not just the overseer state, but the overwriting state,
Mm.
because it takes this parchment that already has the traces of these other legal systems and then writes onto it, but they're still visible if you peel it back. You mentioned the Chinese systems too. That's also, the Chinese were the real
Right.
labor innovators in Southeast Asia. I mean, they introduced the Kongxi system, this kind of vertically integrated system of labor recruitment, transportation, and management, and which worked, partly through the Kongsi and partly through the secret societies. And the British just basically adopt it. They do not radically transform it. All they want to do is reduce the influence of the management level of the secret society and the management level of the Kongsi. And they don't even touch the Kongsi that much because they're content to let the Kongsi continue to run labor in the interior. They don't like the idea of secret society headmen having undue influence or more influence than their own legal institutions in the cities. And that's really all that happens. That's what keeps it working.
Right. And just to provide some extra context, in some of the later chapters, you deal with how the British both make use of and then come into conflict with systems of recruitment in China and India that get partially incorporated into an imperial system of labor allocation.
Yeah. Well, they didn't. I mean, there's no need for them to reinvent the wheel. The
Right.
Chinese already have these networks of recruitment and transportation set up. They already have the kind of the managers. They have like the intake people. Like it's a very, very sophisticated system that they create. And the British, whether out of real, pragmatism, probably they just realized like this is already all there. We just have to cut the head off the snake. And there's this great line where one of the officials in Singapore says, it's important that Singapore, Kuala Lumpur says they must know their master and we must know them.
Mm.
This kind of parallel process of both making visible the authority of the British state, but also educating the Chinese workers about authority. Because the assumption of the British, and whether or not this is true is another question, the assumption of the British is always that Chinese laborers, the Chinese sojourners, are very amenable to hierarchy, that they're very amenable to systems of control,
Mhm.
but they only respond to them positively when they're educated about them, like when it's explained to them, like this is how it works. And even that idea is actually a product of colonial knowledge because you have really the first true sinologist who starts off, this guy Gustav Schlegel, who starts off in Batavia, and then he writes this giant volume about the secret societies, and that becomes kind of the Bible for British administrators to read and be like, yes, like this is how Chinese workers understand. And that a lot of the myths and stereotypes about Chinese workers, about secret societies, about the Tongs that spread from Southeast Asia to South Africa to Western Canada, a lot of them originate both with that document and with the employment by British administrators who then republish it in things like the Journal of the Malaysian branch of the Royal Society and so on and so forth. So it's it to trace, and I know you do this too in your book really well. We're so obsessed with origins, to trace that kernel of an idea. Even as I think we still kind of follow this Foucault's archaeology of knowledge, that there's no one source, but to at least find one major trunk from which these other forms of knowledge emerge was to me one of the most interesting parts of the project.
Hmm. Your response here is also, I think, illustrating just for the audience some of the geographic scope of the book, because while in some of the earlier chapters there's a closer focus in the Caribbean and the question of abolition there, later on the work moves toward Malaysia to Southeast Asia. Right, you're following the overseer state across time, but also significantly across space. I did want to come back to the earlier period,
Hmm.
in part just to say I was very struck by the work on amelioration.
Mm,
And I think it's chapter two, which was, of course, a set of efforts to reform the law of slavery itself after the abolition of the slave trade, but before the abolition of slavery, so 1810s,
hmm.
1820s. And I think amelioration is understudied in its
I
own
agree.
right. So I
Yeah.
appreciated that. But the point here, I think, is also to connect amelioration to then the longer post-emancipation history of indenture. And I wanted to ask you about that. Why is amelioration important to understanding what happens afterward in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s?
Yeah, yeah, and beyond even.
Yeah.
Well, I would say amelioration is really this first great British experiment in labor in colonial labor reform and governance. It's
Right.
really the first time that both the principle and then the institutions and practices of the state as the regulator and moderate and mediator between owners and labor. And it's really the first time too that enslaved people are being defined as a governable population,
Mm,
which I think is an absolutely essential moment, because there's a lot of discussion I think going on now, and it happens with historians, it happens with post-colonial scholars, it happens with slavery scholars, it happens with theorists of governance. This idea of trying to draw not slavery versus free labor, but this trajectory of coerced free versus unfree, coerced and unfree versus free labor, and that all the systems we're talking about really exist on this spectrum rather than
mm,
in this divide. Um, I find mapping onto that the question of governable subjects. You know,
mm,
what is the remit of the state? Who is the responsibility of the state? How does the state gain knowledge about that and then deploy that knowledge as authority and regulation? Um, I don't think it. I think it doesn't start with amelioration per se. I actually think it starts in the kind of mid 18th century with this period of extended warfare. Because
mm,
the other source of, and again, I talk about this more in the next work, the other source of these new types of governance besides the continent, the other model is military governance. And so I think the Napoleonic period is extremely important because the vast expanse of the government's ability to count and regulate and monitor large populations, really happens in that period. So amelioration is almost the civilian version of Napoleonic military governance in more ways than one. Some of the officials are drawn directly from the military, right? Because who do you have at the end of the Napoleonic Wars who has experience in governance, experience in the tropical colonies, who has kind of some legal knowledge and understands coercive hierarchical governance? Ex-military officers. So when you get these protectors and guardians of slaves, and again, you know this from your own work, but I don't know if the audience does, these protectors and guardians and slaves, the vast majority of them are former military officers.
mm,
And of course, the governors of these crown colonies are all governor generals. They are military officers. Um, and whereas in the UK you get this really harsh, at least on paper and in dialogue, this harsh divide between military and civilian governance. In the Anglo-Caribbean, they're completely merged. They're absolutely merged, and no one really raises any problems with it.
Mhm. Hearing you say that does make me remember that there are quite a few references to that kind of career trajectory among the various Crown Colony governors that you discuss and deal with. And then I think you're right. It's another important element of understanding what Crown Colony governance was in the
Yeah,
mid
yeah.
18th century.
Yeah, and I think those two projects, the Crown Colony experiment and labor as a central focus of governance and workers as governable colonial workers as governable subjects, those are all happening at the same time and they're all very much interlinked.
Yeah. Um, Another major subject I wanted to ask about is labor law.
Mm,
There's a lot of it in the book, and of course the regulation of labor more broadly. And in many instances, and this is convincing, labor law appears as a means of punishment, of control. There's a certain discussion of the criminal penalties imposed on contract laborers in various contexts. But then throughout the book, you also assert that labor law and the state's language of protection and its regulatory institutions became a site of contestation, and that protest from below shaped the overseer state over time. And so that reminded me of the anthropology-inspired legal history of law as contestation within a normative order, and laws negotiation.
hmm.
So, can you tell us more about that, about laws negotiation versus laws punishment or control, and how overall you see labor law
Sure,
in this?
sure.
Yeah.
Well, this is where sort of my origins as a legal scholar sort of show through, is I never seem to be able to get away from law and sites of legal contest because the records are so fascinating,
Right.
and even in a mediated sense, it's one of the few places where you hear the testimony of the people on the sharp end of authority. Again, through a filter, it's an interpretation, not word for word, but as someone who kind of found their roots in working class women going to the magistrates courts, it was really interesting to see how close the complaints of workers are in, say, or enslaved workers are in, say, 1819 are to the complaints of working class women in London in, say, 1860. And it begs this
Mhm.
question of the degree to which any courtroom is a site that shapes the narrative of grievance in very
Mhm.
particular ways. Um, well, I think you actually summarized it really well, and that we can see law at one level as this kind of structural element, this relatively objective element that we can trace through the evolution of statutes and look at them as a legal scholar would. This law builds on this precedent, and then as a reinterpretation of this, going back to some of the things we talked about it before. Regulations of legal governance, continental laws. Or we can see it as a realm of discourse and ideas about larger concepts like justice, order, freedom, rights. Um, my personal interest lies in the midpoint between the two, which is in
Mm.
that concrete encounter between the folks expressing authority and the folks against whom that authority is expressed, and how and this is Marjorie Levin Clark's phrase, which she used at a conference panel at the NACBS years ago. She called it "close encounters with the law," which I thought was a really nice touch. And what I was most interested in doing is not writing the social history of that, of saying, okay, well, this happened at this time, and isn't it interesting, and then just moving on, but talking about how it's useful to look at that and to trace how a single case or a concept that emerges, an argument that emerges within a case, can filter up these levels of official discourse to the point at which, and this is not an exaggeration, I talk about it in the book, you have a case made by an enslaved man in the process of a grievance that ends up being discussed in Parliament and actually becomes the basis for arguments about reform. So watching that exchange, watching that go up and down, because then, that argument goes all the way up to Parliament and gets voiced by, anti-slavery activists, causes a reform. That reform comes back down the system. That changes the way law is employed in these encounters, which then leads to other types of contestation, which then continue to filter back and forth. Um,
Mhm.
the other part that I found to me most interesting, and I know again you look at this too, is in the creation of this official record, how that record then can be used by those who oppose it, whether they're opposing slavery or indenture, as evidence to undermine the system, as proof that it is contradicting its own principles. That it claims to be about order, but really it's about repression. That it claims to give justice, but it only hands injustice. That it claims to be furthering social and economic progress, but actually it's doing great economic and social harm and undermining public order. Um, and there's a great, I think that I talk about it in the book, but I also talk about it in this History Workshop Journal article where these indentured laborers are confronting this magistrate across a plantation road and they're on strike, and the magistrate tells them to disperse in the name of the queen, and they say the queen's not here, the queen's in England, and that's
Mhm.
and they say you must hold court here and give us our rights. And that sense that they have understood, these indentured laborers who are often, even in, like, I think really good histories of them from an earlier period, are sometimes described as kind of hacky sticks with legs. They're always either rioting or just being beaten down. But
Mhm.
that, I think, quite sophisticated engagement with the idea of justice, the idea of rights, what is a courtroom,
Mhm.
and what is their role within it. I found that to be the most interesting.
Mhm. Including how is the monarch or the notion of the state imagined and repurposed, and potentially another um, arena where we could have a long-term comparative imperial analysis. Is a long history of this taking up the language of
Yeah,
protection and the notion of either a monarch or a higher state authority
yeah,
that
yeah.
is meant to guarantee protection, like, as against the local
Yeah. And
authorities.
with the enslaved population that also gets wrapped up, and actually the Cambridge series is about to publish, is just published another book about this. Um, as the enslaved are encounter Christian missionaries more, and Methodist missionaries, the language of religion also gets tied up with that as well. Because they respond to the language of abolition. They kind of meld it with their own ideas about what is the divine, versus the secular. And there's again a great moment. It's not. I think it might be just prior to the Demerara revolt, where this group of demonstrating laborers is confronted by these constables that say, "Look, you got to stop doing this." And one of them says, "Did not God make us of the same flesh as the whites?" And that
Mhm.
idea of the justice is linked in these divine concepts of justice and rights, I also find really, really interesting.
Mhm. I think this discussion maybe leads us to a related question about the end of indenture,
Mm,
also a subject in the book. And in many works, the end of indenture is explained in part as the result of shifts in the imperial economy and the declining price of sugar, collapse of sugar plantation economy, and as a kind of exogenous force, which is Indian nationalism and its critique of at least the Indian indenture system.
yeah.
Um, but I read you as offering at least a partial revision of that, and suggesting that there are other sources of critique more from within rather than from without. Would you like to comment on the end of indenture in the
Sure, sure.
book?
And I don't want to downplay the importance of Indian nationalism and Gandhi's opposition to indenture, the final legal end.
Right.
But I'll come back to that point in a moment if there is an end or not. But I think when you look in the Southeast Asian context, you get a very different picture. You get workers themselves given
Mm,
another option, don't want to participate in indenture. And because that's a site of labor competition, the real purpose of the indenture laws in Malaysia was to prevent laborers from going to better paid areas, say, in Sumatra. Um, once that system there are other options, and a lot of them are really done at the initiation of both Chinese and Indian workers. It's understood by the people organizing these labor systems of transportation, who are largely at this point Indian and Chinese with backers, with British and European backers. It's understood that these workers just they don't want long-term fixed contracts. They don't
Hmm.
want that. They just want a better wage and they want a more flexible system so that they can actually express labor mobility. And I've often seen indenture as primary a means of preventing labor mobility, even though it's billed as a system of, as you've quite wrote, free labor. It's all about making sure that the sugar industry and other industries that require continuous labor force have it, and that they cannot move, and that the planters are not motivated to offer better wages because it's illegal to take them. And that's why the documentary aspect of it is so important. And you see that in Mauritius too, as you get more and more um, freed Indians becoming landowners themselves and seeking labor. So in many ways, the story of the end of indenture, yes, like the formal end happens that way, but the informal end, the undermining of its use and the decrease of its popularity, that really comes from workers' agency.
Hmm.
But it does raise a question, which is, does indenture really end? I mean, yes, it ends informally, um, but and I think there's an interesting contrast between the way we talk about modern slavery today. Actually what we call modern slavery is much closer to modern indenture in the
Yeah.
way that it operates functionally. And yet, because the term slavery has such immense moral resonance, culturally and politically, it's much more effective to say, well, this is modern slavery. We need to stop it. Um, if we structurally see it as modern indenture, though, you see this long continuity. You see a labor system. This is the system that was used to build the World Cup soccer stadiums. It's the same thing in many ways, and yet there isn't this great public outcry against it, or it's only the outcry only comes when the methods are so visible and so extreme that they can be labeled modern slavery. Um,
Hmm.
when it like I said, this is I think indenture by another name. And
Hmm.
I'd love to see an equally powerful and vocal movement against modern indenture come out. But that then we get back to that spectrum of, okay, well, if it's exploited but they're technically voluntary laborers, is this really, is it indenture, is it slavery? Like, how's that work? I don't think it'll ever work, because indenture is not a word that has entered the popular lexicon with the same political and moral resonance as slavery
Right.
has. But maybe that day will come. I'd love to see statues and commemorations. Like the one that was put up in British Guiana to these Indian workers who were killed on Devonshire Castle plantation just a few years ago. But I mean, we're talking about a system that in Southeast Asia alone, you moved
Hmm.
like 5 million Chinese workers,
Hmm.
and another million Indian workers. Like, surely that deserves commemoration, memorialization, and some level of, reparations and restorative justice.
I think that's a great point. And of course, some work on the legacies of indenture focuses on diaspora populations and memory and identity, but maybe there's another line of work that's about a labor legacy and ongoing, including ongoing recruitment from some similar areas, now involving different kinds of work. But as you said, a form of modern slavery that actually may be better described as modern indenture.
Yeah, and we still
Um,
talk about the global labor market as basically a good, like, well, the global
right.
labor market. But if we think about the global labor market as having its origins really in indenture, that changes kind of the moral context of it, I think, in an
Yeah.
important way.
Yeah. We have about 15 minutes left, so I think it would be wonderful to bring in some questions from everyone here. And then, of course, we can continue to ask questions too. Jeffrey, would you like to? I'm happy to read the question aloud, or you can jump in and yeah.
Hi, John. Hi, Sasha. Good to
Hi,
see
Jeff. How
you.
are you?
You all can read the question as well as I, but sure. Great talk, Sasha, and a really great project. And by the way, I love the title. I think that was a really good choice for what that's worth. I'm just curious, as I wrote, which sources you found most central and useful to this project?
Um, I think for me, the ones that I found the most interesting were the records of the grievances put forward during the amelioration. That, and I found them in there's published ones which were put together by the Colonial Office, but the ones I enjoyed the most and unfortunately got the least amount of play in this book, but are going to get a lot more attention in the next one, are the Mauritian records, which is a really, really Jonathan's work there too. It's a really, really rich source. And because of my earlier work on the magistrates courts, getting that ground level perspective, and trying to see how ideas about justice and rights and labor are articulated by the people who experience the sharp end of it. To me, that was the most interesting. I think it's also worth looking at these amelioration records, even though they're used very, very extensively. And Caroline Corrier Spence has this wonderful unpublished PhD dissertation. I don't know why it was never published because everyone cites it and it's amazing.
Yeah.
But looking at them as not in the same way I think that people have looked at it as just sort of a kind of direct lens into these processes, but more as a kind of archive building exercise in which the state, by packaging these grievances, packaging these records in a particular way, is justifying its coercive expression of power in contrast to its camouflage of liberalism and freedom.
I'd certainly love to hear more about that Mauritian archive experience. Maybe that's a postscript, but a place with institutional challenges, but a lot of incredible records that weren't lost or destroyed. Um, Phil Harling. Oops, you're just still muted. Sorry.
Sorry about that. I was getting in too much of a passive mode. Sascha, thank you so much. John, thank you so much for your part of the conversation. Thank you both for writing two really splendid books over the past year that have given me so much food for thought. And Sascha, I'm really glad that I loved your original title for the book, but I'm glad you changed it because I think the concept of the overseer state will really have legs and really help me to kind of understand better imperial governance over this ever widening tropical belt for such a long period of time. And I have a ton of questions I could ask you, but one of the many things I really admire about the book is this geographical expansiveness and the way it puts the experience of, excuse me, Indian workers and Chinese workers together, and looks at the Caribbean and Malaysia through the same conceptual lens, and that's very ambitious. It's really hard to do that kind of geographically expansive work. And I wanted to ask you, what did you find to be the biggest challenges in putting these two different worlds, but that are tied together, I think, quite brilliantly in your scholarship here into conversation with each other?
I think the most challenging part, besides just getting over my fear of diving into these very rich literatures. The hardest part is convincing scholars of Southeast Asia they should care about the Caribbean, and convincing scholars of the Caribbean they should care about Southeast Asia. Um, you know, because I think less so, I think, for the past 10 years, but a lot of the, earlier work in the established lights, they very carefully chose their region and really wanted to, delve into the regional dynamics of it. I think we have to give a lot of credit to the early historians of the Indian diaspora, really, for breaking that open and saying that no, like this, if we're following populations and we're following lived experience, we can't just talk about these things in isolation. We have to talk about Nagatapam in the same frame that we're talking about South Africa, in the same frame that we're talking about Jamaica. So in many ways, I think the ground was already laid for that. I guess the hardest part is it was more the writing process, is how much of a context, when I switch regions, how much of a context do I have to give the reader and say, okay, this is kind of the general thing of what's going. How much do people need to know about, the Larut Wars in Malaysia to understand the changes of the state? But I think this is why, having that central topic and sticking to that main vein of argument is so important, as John was saying earlier, because it's very easy for this to become fragmented. And in many ways, it becomes an exercise of building argumentative coherence through whatever methods you can. The real danger is always finding what you're looking for. So if I can convince intelligent readers like yourself that, okay, this does hold together, then you're not looking too far into the engine to see, okay, like, well, if we move out of this, how, are there really dramatic distances between the populations you're talking about, their experiences, and the modes of governance. I think that's also the advantage of talking about the state, is it's building itself, right? I mean, this is the imperial state. They do borrow from one another, and the entire direction, I think, of studies of the British Empire in particular has been going in that direction of networks and connections. And we have folks like, David Lambert to thank for, these imperial careering ideas. So again, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants when I do this stuff.
Thanks for that, and thanks for a terrific book. Everybody read it, please.
Thanks,
It's
Phil.
a really
Appreciate
good
that.
one.
And maybe I'll just add that Phil's book, Managing Mobility, also in conversation here in terms of
Absolutely.
how efforts to regulate labor migration across different parts of the empire in different situations change colonial governance over time. But yes, would you like to? Sorry, I don't see your full name on the screen, but please.
Sorry about that. My name is Humberto Garcia.
Yeah,
Yeah, I just, I guess, I really like the whole framework actually of the overseer state. And as I was reading this book, these parallels became very clear to me and very compelling and convincing. So, and I'm pretty much, a literary scholar, cultural critic, and, a historian of intellectual ideas. And I pretty much focus on Britain. So I was very interested in, well, pretty much what's not covered in your book for good reasons, right? I mean, you mentioned earlier you didn't really get into the conversation about the reform of the new poor laws, the way that the white working class were being managed, particularly the
Yeah.
use of the vagrancy laws. I
Oh
found
yeah.
that discussion really illuminating because the parallels are so strong in how the vagrancy laws are being refined and fine-tweaked to be able to create these kind of surplus labor reserves within
Hmm.
England, right?
Yeah.
That really fueled, a kind of industrial modernity, right? So I'm interested in those links, but also the fact that a lot of these indentured Indian workers or Chinese workers ended up in Britain, right?
Hmm.
And I wonder if the overseer state as a concept could really apply to that situation where the vagrancy laws were being instituted, particularly against foreign mariners and
Hmm.
seafarers, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Indian sailors, particularly Lascars. And the
Yep.
situation there was very interesting because the vagrancy laws were being used to cut off the crimps, right?
Yep.
Cut
Yep.
off the head of the snake, like you said,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And it was the same process that you're describing in other colonial plantation regions in the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. And I found that absolutely illuminating because there is a pattern that goes back to Britain. And it was happening in the 1840s and 50s, right?
Yeah.
Almost the same time that you're covering. But the difference there was that the state would say, well, if we're going to, help these people or provide philanthropic or humanitarian help, right, for these moral panic of these vagrants all over Britain, particularly these foreign vagrants coming through the merchant marine or the navy that have been left abandoned, the idea was the state would not intervene. They would
Mm.
use humanitarian organizations, philanthropists, Christian missionaries to instead round up the and do the same thing that you're describing there. And
Yeah.
so here's where I'm going to kind of push you a little bit more to think
Sure.
outside the book,
Hmm.
because it seems to me like in Britain, it's not so much an overseer state, although it has parallels to what you're tracing in other colonial plantations, but it's
Hmm.
the outsourcer state.
Hmm.
It
Hmm.
outsources these processes to different philanthropic organizations. I wonder if something similar is happening in the regions that you're covering, or is it it's just a separate dynamic, or am I not understanding properly the whole idea of the overseer state as one that already includes outsourcing within it from the get-go? I mean, like you mentioned, like the way that, indigenous recruiters in the Chinese
Yeah.
systems were being incorporated. I wonder, does that mode of outsourcing, is that something that is central to the overseer state, or is something that becomes more pronounced, let's say, in Britain itself, and dealing, let's say, like runaway coolies in London?
Yeah, yeah. I was really good. There's a lot to unpack there, so
Yeah,
forgive me if I just answer as succinctly as
sure.
possible to give a chance for other questions. But in some ways, you're anticipating a lot of the argument for the next book, which talks about a lot more about the connections between colonial governance experiments and colonial governance, especially labor governance, and their metropolitan iterations. And vagrancy is it actually is the discussion of vagrancy that led me to that. So the article that's coming out in the past and present supplement later this year is all about the origins of modern public health in the colonial context. And like the control, like vagrancy, when I get into the sort of 1830s and 1840s, vagrancy is very much at the center of that, and the contrast between how vagrancy is treated in the colonial context and the parallels between how it's treated in the colonial context and the metropolitan context. So yeah, I think this is what I'm trying to do with the next book is sort of, I jokingly call Overseer State Part Two. Is about, okay, if we look at health, can we draw those connections more solidly? In terms of the outsourcing question, I might steal that idea, the outsourcing state. I really like it. I'll give you credit for it. Don't worry, Robert, Roberto. Is absolutely, I think, I make the argument that really the overseer state is the collusion of property owners and the state, and the state has a vested interest in this. This is an exercise in political economy and the sort of structuring of an economy through political means. Um, but you also have, yeah, you have the Methodist Church, you have the Anglican Church. You don't in the colonial context, you don't have the apparatus of philanthropic societies that you do in the metropole, but you do have an apparatus of colonial knowledge generation, which works in tandem with it. And the Royal Societies are probably the best example. So I mentioned Gustav Schlegel, this father of modern sinology. He is part of the Malaysian branch of the Royal Society, as are most of the high officers running the Strait settlements. So there's this constant interchange between these learned societies and modes of governance. And I think one of the ways we can define modern governance, whether and sort of this reciprocal relationship between governance and modernity, is really by looking at those interchanges of networks of knowledge and expertise and how they translate into methods of governance, but then how methods of governance produce knowledge that then filters into this knowledge generation. That's going back to like Cohn's ideas about the generation of colonial knowledge.
Yeah. Well, I'm really looking forward to reading your upcoming article and book because
Thanks.
there's much more to say here. But yeah,
Yeah,
I'll be
no, and
quiet.
you're this is just it's a great comment.
So we are coming up on time, but we do have just maybe two questions in the chat. Maybe if I read them real quick, could you give maybe a really brief
A great
response and then
idea.
we'll
Okay.
Okay, so we've got first from Matt, which is, would you agree that the amelioration policies, 1810 SFF, constituted not the pioneering intervention of the state per se in coerced labor in the British Empire, but of the central imperial state? It strikes me that as such, this was an important turning point in the history of sovereignty within the empire, but would you agree? And then another from Nathaniel Coleman that says, it was suggested that a colonial indenture continues in what is currently referred to as contemporary slavery or modern slavery. Professor Diamond Ashgabor argues for a stronger and perhaps more radical claim. Colonial indenture is the blueprint for the contemporary standard form employment contract. What are the relative merits of the two claims?
Yeah, both really great questions and hard to answer briefly, but I will. In terms of the creation of the imperial state, well, we're this is one of the great debates in imperial, like what is the imperial state? Is it simply the sum total of institutions that stretch across multiple empires, multiple colonial sites? I like to kind of think about the transcolonial state more than the imperial state. I think the relationship between innovations in governance in one colony, even if it comes from initially the colonial office, like some of the initial orders of amelioration are really developed as an exchange between British Guiana and the colonial office, or Barbados and the colonial office, or Trinidad is a big one, Trinidad and the colonial office. Rather than kind of hewing to that center periphery model, I'm more interested in seeing how developments in one colony then move to another colony. And sometimes it's a triangle. Sometimes it has to go to the metropole first and then to another colony, but sometimes it moves directly because, again, as Imperial Careering talks about, these officials are peripatetic and the ideas and concepts are peripatetic too. Also, as we've been talking about a lot, I'm increasingly uncomfortable with the distinction between colonial state, metropolitan state, and imperial state. I think they are all connected in very, very fundamental ways. And what term we can use for those fundamental interconnections, whereas methods, apparatus, people, and ideas about governance are generated in one context and then move quite quickly to another context. I mean, the overseer state refers to labor governance. Can we talk about it in other ways? Can we talk about, say, health governance as something that moves in different directions, both across colonies, both directly and via the metropole, or for me, the most interesting is when they move from the colonies to the metropole. For example, fingerprinting is first used by the Bengal police and later becomes like the primary form of criminal identification in Britain. To Tobias' question, which again is a really great one and just kind of a big conceptual question, I would probably it's neck and neck, but I'd probably come down on the second proposition that indenture is really a blueprint for in many ways, modern labor relations. If we were going to define the essential condition of modern labor in that it's peripatetic, both regionally and globally, that it does involve criminalizing offenses by the laborer while turning offenses by the employer primarily into civil offenses, and that its goal is to foster the idea of mobility and freedom in its discourse, but in its function, it's about controlling labor. That I think that's where that argument takes us.
Excellent. Thanks. You did that in good time. So we will wrap it up there then. I want to thank John and Sascha for joining us, and I want to thank everyone else who came, who attended today. And I hope that you all will join me in thanking John and Sascha for such a wonderful discussion. So thanks to both.
Thank you all, and especially the familiar faces. I saw Dane and Nadia, and I didn't get a chance to say hello. Thanks so much for coming.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you.